What does Islam say about gender and sexuality? Islam was founded among the Arab people, a nation who for thousands of years have adhered to the rites and practices of Prophet Abraham and his sons Isaac and Ishmael. Before the advent of Islam, Arabs strictly adhered to following the rituals of Abraham and his wife Hagar, and subsequently performed the pilgrimage or Hajj, to the Temple of Abraham, which Arabs identified as the Kaaba. Religion in most societies came as a byproduct of civilization where unchanging ideals such as love and mercy served as an example of obeisance. Islam opened the door to another avenue and introduced the use of analogy in religious doctrines. Although logic can in no way substitute for acquiring knowledge, but the ability to reason paves the way for the gaining insight into the tenets of Islamic faith. In order for a scholar to transcend to morality, one must master the maze of love, fear and hope through experiencing the tide of knowledge. The preeminence of Islamic ideals regimented the centrifugal system of cultural values in the Arabian Peninsula and suggested a new prospect to a nation that was immersed in symbolism, astrology and paganism. Islamic law has been a system of governance for billions of people. For over 14 centuries, this social ordinance evolved around cultures, merging with developing civilizations to inculcate values to the adherents of morality and ethics. Although Islam is not seen as a theocratic religion, the conception of Islamic law comes from the founding texts of the Quran, which according to the famous Scottish Orientalist and also a critic of Islam, Sir William Muir, who declared in his book The Life of Muhammad, that no other book has remained in its pristine form as had the Quran, which remained unchanged through centuries. The culture in which Islam first prominence is the Arabic-speaking section of the Middle East. In 6th century Arabia, the desert land was inhabited by numerous clans and tribes. The tribal and filial bond between Arabs in general are fiercely strong and protective. Each man considers the other to be his brother, and little distinction is made between blood relations and close friends. For Arabs, an 80-year-old man would consider himself to be a father or grandfatherly figure to an 18-year-old fellow, and hence the bond among the two would be inseparable in a very asexual way. To consider such a person as a means for sexual pleasure is considered abhorring in the general Arab culture and is considered a breach of trust. After Islam gained prominence, its prophet Muhammad spelled out strict guidelines in order to protect children and women from inadvertent abuse, and therefore, banned fornication, beating women or children, pedophilia, incest and homosexuality. These laws were meant to protect the future generations from traumatic experiences. Without unchanging religious laws in place, programs like the Kentler Project took place. In this experiment, homeless children in West Berlin were intentionally placed with pedophile men, under the assumption that those men would make especially loving foster parents, and for nearly 30 years, the pedophile foster fathers were granted regular care allowance. Researchers at that time were convinced that sexual contact between adults and children was harmless. However, Islam banned this practice 1400 years ago. The laws of Islam span a vast horizon, where hospitality, kindness, assisting the wayfarer and sheltering the orphan are religious obligations. Islam came in Arabia at a time when Europe was in the Dark Ages, having entered the early medieval period, with present-day civilizations like Britain and France ruled sparingly, by Anglo-Saxon and Brythonic kingdoms, who themselves were trying to recover from economic and dogmatic depressions. Women and minorities faced harsh laws on a daily basis at this time and could enjoy little rights. The division of social privileges remained rooted until much later. The British author and commentator Karen Armstrong elucidated the plight of women in the Middle Ages in her book, Muhammad, a biography of the Prophet. She writes that Muslims were horrified to see the way Western Christians treated their women in the Crusader states, and Christian scholars denounced Islam for giving too much power to menials like slaves and women. Athenian laws also restricted women's monetary freedom by barring them from engaging in legal contracts or appearing in law courts. Slaves and foreign citizens had little rights under Roman laws, and even free women did not have the right to vote. During the Renaissance, the rights of women did not improve, and incidentally it was at this time that two of the wives of Henry VIII, Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard, were beheaded for adultery and improper conduct, respectively. Until 1900, a woman's property would belong to her husband upon marriage. As for inheritance, a daughter could inherit no real property in the presence of a male heir, who would inherit the father's property in its entirety. From the actions of the past few centuries, we have seen how laws were blended with autocratic regimes and were used to justify atrocities. What was legal then may not have been necessarily right. Slavery was once legal in America, as was segregation, despite a functional democratic government wielding authority, not to mention in World War II era of Europe when Holocaust was legal in Germany and the democratically elected government in Nazi Germany passed the Nuremberg Laws for the protection of German blood and German honor in September of 1935, that embodied Nazi ideology and provided the legal framework for the systematic persecution of Jews in Germany and enabled the murders of millions of civilian women and children. Islam is the most misinterpreted and misjudged faith in this century. A thing so intense and compact should not be obliterated from recent civilizations because it could deprive our societies from gaining valuable insight. It is particularly imperative that people should know Islam as to what it really is and learn it from those who are actively involved in attaining and articulating it, such as qualified Islamic scholars and jurists, so that they are not deprived completely of the great virtues and enlightenment of Islamic law, and not be blinded by ignorance and bias. Islamic laws are a way to ensure our protection, because although Holocaust and slavery are now illegal, in the course of time, one cannot be certain if it is going to stay that way. One example of such a case of modern law's regression is found in the recent French mission against Muslim women who choose to wear long-sleeved shirts to beaches. Up to now, numerous women have been charged with hefty fines for covering their bodies while the less fortunate ones were forcibly undressed at gunpoint as French police zealously attempted to maintain order by enforcing recently passed French laws which banned women from wearing coverings in beaches. As a result of such a vulnerable legal structure within the network of Western civilizations, basic freedom of many were curtailed. Muslim jurists encompass independent philosophies within their mind, which includes consulting the scriptures of the prophets Abraham, Moses, and Jesus as they seek to express a lasting affirmation to the. Islam accepts the message of other biblical faiths, and the Islamic religious law is based on the commandments of previous religions, such that the denying of the religious messages of Judaism and Christianity is paramount to denying Islamic law itself. Muslim scholars who conduct research on Islamic law give religious advice in such a way that he or she brings the past to the present, and must articulate his or her fatwa's analogy, in such a way that if the Prophet were to be here, he would have agreed with that analytical reasoning. Those people who think Islamic law is a set of demonic rules are sadly mistaken. These laws bring together civility and does not contradict with any civilizations. It incorporates itself within the Ten Commandments because as long as a law is against violence, it will not conflict with Quran's law, which is a set of social practice based on moral law. Although there is a minority who fails to understand what Islam seeks to advocate, and they call on to ban Islamic religious law, due to some people who have committed crimes and attributed their crimes to these laws. However, these laws are a set of moral, intellectual and progressive way of life which can be adopted by any race, nationality, religion or country because it is against injustice, cruelty and violence. Those who preach against Islamic law are blinded by ignorance, because this law is nothing but a practice of kindness. The Islamic law is against economic oppression as well as political coercions. For centuries, Islam faced much prejudice and distrust in the non-Muslim majority Europe. In his book, L'Europe et l'Islam, the Tunisian author, Hicham Djait, echoes the sentiment. The fact remains that medieval prejudices insinuated themselves into the collective unconscious of the West at so profound a level that one may ask in terror, whether they can ever be extirpated from it. When skeptics claim that religious laws breeds violence, they should review historical facts, such as the regimes of Stalin and secular Germany, where we witnessed most horrific civic crimes. In recent times, the entity who had achieved to distort the image of Sharia are the ISIS, whereas they committed such crimes which if done by a Muslim, he becomes an infidel. It is ironic that those terrorist networks killed many more Muslims than they killed non-Muslims, and yet ISIS was successful in preaching hatred by displaying a false facade of Islam, by doing every action that Islamic law forbids. Those who think religious law breeds violence are wrong, because most violence like World War I and World War II were the cause of the most deplorable crimes and violence. Islam, however, is an extended version of social and peaceful laws. Those who use Islam to commit crimes or to influence political ideologies are also deeply deviated. Islamic law could be used as an elementary blueprint to further the expansion of law in most countries, because of its changeless nature. From the study of Islamic history as well the fundamentals of this creed, it appears to be a righteous set of laws from the beginning of time. Islamic Sharia laws are against racism, bigotry, oppression and violence. The fundamental principle of Islam was cemented on the notion of equality, and its prophet, Muhammad, spent his entire life campaigning to uproot injustice in the world. He forgave his enemies, most famous of which was his general amnesty to the Meccans who had persecuted him for over a decade and eventually drove him out of his birthplace. As a result, Muhammad was attributed titles such as the Trustworthy, and the Merciful, even by his enemies. Until his dying breath, he attempted to abolish slavery by passing edicts mandating the emancipation of slaves, since slavery was not compatible with the teaching of Islam or the Quran. The close household and friends of Prophet Muhammad freed over 40,000 slaves during the propagation of Islam. For centuries, Arabs have been merchants, and oftentimes, had engaged in passive warfare to protect their business interests or defend their families. In such battles, men would bond over a robust system of comradeship, in which sexual relationships would have no scope or feasible option. To them, an older man engaging in sexual activities with a younger man would be a betrayal of trust to the highest degree. In the Arab mindset, sexual activities between men are considered a breach of the sacred brotherhood that binds them together and enable one to shed his blood to protect the other. They feel as though the unconditional brotherly love would be shattered if men engaged in sexual relationships and later, for some reason, had to break up, and begin to harbor rancor to one another over petty jealousies. In Islam, the body of human beings is considered a sacred temple, which belongs to God alone. No one has the right to tarnish or taint one's own body, or for that matter, another's body, to the point that even having tattoo done is strictly forbidden in the Islamic laws. It follows the logic that our body was created by God, and is owned by God, who purchased our souls in exchange of an eternal heaven, and therefore, we may not do with it as we please. Torturing or killing one's own self is forbidden as it killing another person, because no man or woman had the right to take, or desecrate, or harm a body God has made sacred. Suicide, therefore, is murder, and is subsequently forbidden by the Islamic religious laws. Prophet Muhammad instructed Muslim men and women to respect their bodies and minds. Objectifying or insulting oneself as well as another is not permitted under any circumstances. As such, even beating a woman or a man is against the prophetic and Quranic teaching and would be therefore impermissible. Even if a woman begs her spouse to beat and strike her, Islam would not permit such practices, due to the simple logic that the body of the woman or man belongs to God, who does not allow anyone to vilify or harm it. Islam also restricts sexual activities to a stringent set of rules, because it does not allow women and men to engage in behavior that would be undignified towards them in any way. While marriage between a man and a woman is condoned in Islam, there are certain rules that adherents of this faith are instructed to live by. In order to build a union devoted solely to the act of procreation, Islam allows sexual activity that would enable the conception of a child. Therefore, anal or oral sex is strictly forbidden in the Islamic law, and God himself condemned the violator of this rule to the strongest punishment of the hereafter. This ban is due to the nature of the act, which is considered to be degrading in the eyes of God because procreation does not take place via anal intercourse or fellatio and is denounced by the Quran and the Prophet. Following this reasoning, sex between men is also banned in Islam because it inadvertently involves anal or oral intercourse, both of which are abominable crimes in the Islamic culture. However, this faith has no scruples or laws in loving a fellow human being, and as such, one has the liberty and is even encouraged to love others, be they men or women. Homosexuality is shunned in Islam, not because it is considered deviant, but because God forbids any sort of carnal relationships between men or women, that does not result in childbearing, as that is considered the sole objective of marriage between a man and a woman. Before critics condemn this Islamic law of disapproving sex between people of the same gender, it should be noted that homosexuality is a sin in Islam as much as backbiting, lying and stealing is. Indeed, it is considered to be in par with adultery or fornication, of which the Prophet insisted that backbiting and slandering fellow man was far worse than any form of sexual deviance or adultery. Having inner pride, too, is considered to be worst sin of all, including homosexuality. The study of Islam deals with the complex relationship between analytic law and reason. In this specialization, the syllabus Muslims follow is designed to evaluate the progression of religious laws through historical anecdotes, through analyzing rather than approving century-old edicts that has transcended through the revolving experiences of man's everyday life. The Prophet Muhammad enabled one world, one humanity, and one creation, to come together to preach love, to live with love, and to die with love. This sentiment can be discerned in the Islamic verses of the Quran, where torchbearers of humanity can gather and learn, not to fight for their survival, but to ensure that millions to come may find a way to happiness, in finding their queries addressed.